Welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to talk about threat-informed defense. We're going to have a little chat about what is it and how to implement it. My name is Ronan Lavelle, and I'm the founder and CEO of Validato. And we are a cyber startup from the UK, and we are an attack simulation platform. We simulate cyber threats in order to test security controls and their effectiveness, which is going to be quite topical for today's theme. Just a few little housekeeping points. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed within 24 hours. Your lines are being muted today, so if you have any questions, which by the way, I do very much encourage you to ask questions, just go to the bottom of your screen. I think it should be on the bottom, and there is a Q&A function. Just type your questions in there. Just a quick security note, please do not use the Zoom chat function, because the chats are recorded as part of the recording. So if you want your question to be private, then please use the Q&A session, and only our team can see that. Perfect. We'll answer the questions at the end of the session. Okay, so firstly, let's start by running a little a definition of what MITRE and their Center for Threat-Informed Defense, how they define what this is. So they basically say that threat-informed defense applies a deep understanding of adversary, tradecraft, and technology to protect against, detect, and mitigate cyber attacks. And they basically also say that it's a community-based approach, and that we should all duck in and help to fight adversaries in the cyber world. This does, however, sound a little bit like General Sun Tzu in The Art of War, obviously, where we're basically saying, let's get to know our enemies better, and then we can be much more effective in battle. But in fact, it's not so much what MITRE are trying to say there. They're actually saying that in today's world, it's much more unrealistic, or it's becoming increasingly unrealistic to try and defend against every single cyber threat out there. Our teams are not resourced to do that. We don't have the funding, and clearly we don't have the time to do that either. So it's much more effective to try and identify the most likely threats that your organization, your business is likely to face, really try and understand those adversaries and the threats and their behaviors in those threats, and then to regularly test your defenses against those known threats rather than against any old threat. So that's really what today's presentation is going to be all about. It's about how do we identify the threats, and then how do we test them in our environment, but not once a year or maybe never, but much more frequently, so that we can report back to our management teams and get a degree of confidence of as to our state of cyber resilience against those known threats. So what is the purpose of threat-informed defense? And I want to start, and this is clearly not my graphic here, this is from MITRE Ingenuity, but what they're really trying to say here is that this is, and it is intended to be, an iterative process. And the first goal here is ultimately to try and align the technical functions of the business. So IT and information security, make sure they are best prepared to deal with known threats that target your business or that business. And secondly, to be able to be in a position to run regular and effective testing of your defenses in order to understand how resilient you will be to that. And obviously then third, to make the necessary changes to the way that your security controls are able to detect those threats, but also the way that they are able to prevent and block those threats. So increase over time your security control effectiveness and your resilience. And that's really ultimately what we're trying to do here. So you might want to ask the question about, okay, we understand threats, we understand we should try and prioritize threats, but where do you get the information in order to do that. Which threats are most important to your region, your company, um, your environment? And there are a number of sources of threat-based intelligence and information. Some of them are free, some of them are commercial and paid for. But first and foremost, government agencies, so particularly CISA in the United States, or the Canadian Cybersecurity Centre, or Centre for Cybersecurity, I should say, the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, and the equivalent organisation in Australia, as well as many other national certs and cyber defence agencies, on a fairly frequent basis, publish cyber threat advisories on high priority threats that either affect or target the geographic area where the threat is, the advisory is published from, or it may be a general advisory. And CISA and NCSC in particular publish these advisories on a fairly frequent basis, including last week, by the way. The second category is that you can get access to this kind of information, or specific threat actor and threat-based data from cyber threat advisory services. So these may be auditors, consultants, analysts, other security advisors, but also the technical media. And I was just reading an article just this week about some of the affiliate groups related to one of the big ransomware gangs and how they operate. It's a very useful insight into how those kind of affiliates operate and what they're doing to do what they do. And then lastly, we've got either open source or commercially available cyber threat intelligence and cyber threat monitoring platforms. And there's a whole plethora of these. And I've just named a number of those kind of organizations on the screen, but there are many, many more, both commercial and free of charge to research. But again, if you want any specific advice on those, we can provide that later if you would like. So how do you go about testing those threats? So once you have understood potentially what are the candidates, what are the threats that are most likely to target your region, your country, your industry, maybe even your high-profile company. We saw an example of this with Sony just within the last 10 days. So what do you do? How do you test your resilience against those kind of threats? And really what this slide is trying to say is that there is an existing or even a traditional way to do this, which is to look at indicators of compromise. This is the malware, the signatures, the hashes, the exploits, vulnerabilities, IP addresses, even domains that are exploited by threat actors through a kill chain and a process for how they execute their attacks. But this is, in some regards, kind of playing whack-a-mole, where if you shut down an IP address, you blacklist it or block it, the attacker can come back tomorrow with a second one or a third one. Or you can look into the future and look at indicators of attacks by using adversarial behaviors, which is a slightly different way to look at cyber defense. And obviously, the core premise and the concepts behind the advice that MITRE and CISA and NCSC and other organizations are increasingly advising and adopting. So here we're talking about the phases and the behaviors of an attack. So what is it that their malware and their exploits are trying to do? Is it possible to harden your defenses to prevent those type of behaviors from being exploited? And we're talking about code execution, the ability to gain persistence, or even move laterally and gain privilege, or even command and control of an environment. And obviously, if we look at this from David Bianco, who's a threat analyst from Splunk, from an adversary perspective, it's really easy to start looking at IOCs and to try and attack a company using malware hashes or IPs, domains. All these things can be blocked, taken down, removed, put onto blacklists, and so on. But once you start looking at tactics, techniques, and procedures, or in other words, behaviors, it's much harder for the adversary to reinvent a new behavior or even adopt a new behavior within the kill chain of their attack process. And there's no better record of those tactics, techniques, and procedures or adversarial behaviors than the MITRE attack framework. I'm going to assume on today's session that everybody's already heard about MITRE attack, but if you haven't, it is an awesome resource that is freely available to the world that kind of documents the adversarial behaviors associated with some of the most common threats. And it's laid out in a kill chain type view, where typically attackers will start to exploit one or more tactical phases and then the techniques within those tactical phases, and typically moving from left to right. So if you look at what this might look like from, say, a government advisory, so recently, within the last 6 weeks or so, the US CISA published a threat advisory on Lockbit, so a new version of the ransomware actor called Lockbit. There are many other examples, by the way, if you go to the CISA website, and there's a link in this presentation which we'll share with you to those threat advisories. But this is a snapshot of some of the MITRE techniques that CISA have identified and are publishing in their threat advisory that relate to the specific threat called Lockbit. Now, as Lockbit is the most prevalent ransomware strain in 2023, it makes a lot of sense to prioritize that particular threat in your environment, potentially, if you think that ransomware is a key business risk. And what Lockbit looks like in MITRE is it looks like something like this. So this is actually Lockbit transposed within the Validato attack simulation environment. And we can see that across the various different tactical phases, Lockbit is exploiting one or more different techniques and sub-techniques within MITRE. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. In fact, I'll talk about it right now. So I'm just going to very quickly stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to reshare. I just have a very wide screen here, so it's just easier to do it this way. Okay, so this isn't intended today to be a product demonstration per se, but the Validato platform, which is an attack simulation platform, is quite a good example of one of several solutions out there that defensive teams can use to either simulate known threat scenarios or to create new threat scenarios in the platform based on intelligence from external sources, and then test your security control effectiveness against that threat and the behaviors that are included in that threat. So here we have a range of different pre-packaged, if you like, threat scenarios. So the ones at the top here are much more generic. So they are things like the most commonly exploited techniques that MITRE have observed in the last 12 months. We've got Lockbit here because it's the most popular ransomware strain this year. And our own Validato Threat Research Group have also identified 25 MITRE techniques that if you tested your controls against those techniques and hardened any gaps, that would disrupt the attack chains of many, many different current threat actors and campaigns. But it could also be your own custom developed scenarios. We'll come back to that in a moment, as well as anything that you might see within attack.mitre.org, which is the web resource related to MITRE attack. So all of these here are typically threat scenarios that are being identified in the MITRE attack web portal. And what we have done in Validato is make them immediately available to you to test. So if you want to test APT32, you can immediately do that literally within 3 mouse clicks. But for the purpose of today, I'm actually going to do this with Lockbit. So I'm not intending today to go into huge detail about how we do what we do. If anyone's interested in that, we can arrange some additional sessions on that. But to test Lockbit in our environment here, I just need to ask myself 3 questions. So the first is, what scenario, what threat are we looking to test? So today's theme is about threat-informed defense. I have intelligence that Lockbit is targeting organizations in our sector, in our region, and our board of directors really wants to know if we are resilient against that particular threat. So let's run that. So I click a mouse button on run that scenario. The second question is, where do I want to run this test? So what is the scope of my test? So I can run this across my whole organization or wherever I have my simulation agents. So these are little lightweight agents that are in different vulnerable build areas, different segments of the network, or they could be different geographic areas of the business as well. So I'm going to run this across 3 parts of my business. And the third question is, who would be the likely target of an attack? So who might be exploited in our employee base? Would it be a high-level privileged IT administrator type user? Or would it be a low-level privileged user, say in finance or HR or some other business function? So you don't actually have to have a definitive answer to that question, because this is a scenario-based testing platform, and you can test multiple user privilege personas. I just have one in my build here. We can have many different flavors of these. And that's it, literally 3 mouse clicks, and I can go off and run that Lockbit test. And in about 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how large the attack simulation scenario is, we will go off and we will have the results. I should say the unbiased results that we can present to our management team and say, do you know what, we're okay or we're not okay, and we need to focus on these areas in order to beef up our security. So when we are looking at the results, we are look at 2 core measurement criteria. The first is what we're defining here as P. So P stands for protection and D stands for detection. And these are really, this is the data that is coming out of our security controls and also our whole IT infrastructure. So we ran a Lockbit ransomware test a little bit earlier today, and we can see the results here. And obviously green is good, red is bad. But we can see that in terms of running this scenario in this part of our organization, we did very well on being able to detect this activity. And I think we did okay on the protection. But the definition of what is okay and what is not okay is really up to you and your appetite for risk. So what do you expect this particular low privilege user to be able to do and not do as part of that person's job? So is it normal, for instance, for a low privileged user to not be blocked for things like Windows command shell exploitations or process injection, or be able to obfuscate files and information? So for most low privileged users that I know in maybe back office functions and so on, these kind of technical terms are not things that they would typically ever come across. So you obviously would probably ask questions about, okay, we do need to address those areas and maybe harden our controls around this type of user role, being able to do these type of things. If we ran this test as a higher level privileged user, then it might be completely normal for IT administrators to run, PowerShell, for instance. It's probably a core part of their job. just maybe not for an administrator in the human resources department. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to our front page here. So we ran one scenario, which is around Lockbit. However, there have been some other threat scenarios that have been advised and published in the last 10 days. So the US government, through CISA, issued an alert around a new ransomware strain called Snatch. So again, the same sort of thing here. We generally have these already in the Validato platform. There are hundreds of pre-designed threat scenarios that you can run. And again, just 3 mouse clicks, I could run that Snatch scenario. But if I wanted to do my own research, or I have been given some information from an advisor or our cyber threat intelligence monitoring service, I can also create my own custom scenarios. So I can call this, for instance, let's just call this test scenario. Actually, let's not do that. Let's call this process injection, because I'm going to do an example around that. And we'll call this a test. So we can either, by the way, select whole tactical phases within MITRE, or if you were not that technical, but you knew what the techniques, the tactics, techniques, and procedures were, you can actually select individual ones here. But equally, we can select individual techniques either by their code or by their actual name. So I'm going to run a test around a thing called process injection, which is technique 1055. So there are sometimes cases where you just want to test your defense against a single technique, or it could be, as we've seen with Lockbit or any of the others, a whole family of techniques that are used within a chain as part of a whole attack path. So here, what we can do is just simply create this scenario. I've had to do very little in order to do this. And here we have our process injection test, and I can run that immediately. And I can run this in my internal data center with my low privileged user, and off I go. And in 10, 15 minutes, I'll probably get the answer to that. So that's a little snapshot of how do you operationalize this kind of information, run an attack simulation based on a threat scenario, and then look at the data and understand how resilient are you and how can you report that back to your management team. So again, I'm just going to remind you, if you have any questions, please go to the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and type your questions, and I'll pick those up at the end of the session. I'm just going to stop and then reshare my screen again, if that's all right. And so obviously we just showed you an example of a platform that takes a threat, allows you to test it. You can do that every week, every month. You can do it more frequently or less frequently, depending on your requirements. But there are a whole load of very useful tools and resources that you could also use, that you should also be aware of. And so I'm going to spend the next few minutes just talking about some of those. So the first, and one of the key ones, is, if you like, the yang to MITRE attack, which is the yin, if you like. So MITRE Defend is MITRE's matrix or knowledge base of defensive countermeasures. So this is a super useful resource that allows defenders to be able to use best practice in order to better harden and prepare your defensive environment to meet some of the threats that we just showed you just now. And so if you're not familiar with MITRE Defend, I do very much advise that you go to defend.mitre.org. Again, the link is in this presentation, which we will share with you after today's presentation. There's also an equally awesome tool that has been developed by CISA and the US Homeland Security, but again is available as a GitHub open source project. And this is called Decider, and it is really amazing. Because what Decider is doing is it is automating what used to be extremely proprietary work that a very tiny proportion of cyber specialists could do in the past, which is to try and map adversarial behaviors to MITRE techniques. So with Decider, all you actually need to do is answer a bunch of questions about what are you observing in what you're seeing from a threat actor in your environment. So this could either be from threat intel that you're getting, or actually from telemetry data that you're actually seeing within your own controls. And what Decider does is it maps out the various MITRE techniques that relate to the observations that you are making. So really, really useful tool. And again, as I said, it's free to use, or free to download and use, and a very, very useful tool in your armory. Then there's a thing called MITRE Engage, but this does come with a bit of a health warning. And really, this is for very advanced users only. And also, if you don't want to bear grudges, I wouldn't use this tool, because this is more about engaging with adversaries and threat actors. And there are some use cases where you might want to do this. It's not something that Validato will ever endorse, but just in the spirit of showing you what tools are out there, I think it's useful for us to be able to show this to you. But again, the link to MITRE Engage is at the bottom of the screen here. And yeah, if you go there, it comes with all sorts of disclaimers about what that site is intended to do. So we've spoken a lot about MITRE, and that is because MITRE really is trying to lead the sea change from looking at defensive activities in terms of IOCs, or indicators of compromise, and try and shift defensive focus to identifying adversarial behaviors and hardening defenses so that those behaviors for unauthorized users cannot be exploited. And that's really what vendors like Validato are all about. We're trying to be a really easy to use platform where you can take that kind of threat scenario and test and simulate it in your environment without causing damage. And I think it's important for us to note that it's not just MITRE, but it's also not just vendors, maybe with biased opinions like Validato, but it is trusted advisors like Gartner, but also government agencies like CISA. But again, NCSC in the UK and other organizations are increasingly beginning to urge the consumers of their advisories to test the adversarial behaviors that are connected to threat groups and threat advisories. And you can either do that manually or use tools. And it's obviously much more efficient to use automated tools like we just shown you today. So I think I will stop here, if that's okay. And I am very happy to take any questions that you have. Remember, if you have any questions, please do type them in the Q&A dialog box, and I'll answer those or do my best to answer them. So we have a couple of questions here already. The first is, do we provide threat intelligence data? So we don't see that as a core role of Validato, but we do work with some of the industry's best sources of threat intelligence data, and some of those sources provide filters based on industry and company type and geographic areas and so on. But there are a whole load of vendors that you could consider, like SOS Intelligence, SOC Radar, some famous ones like Recorded Future, but also Tidal and the government agencies that we mentioned earlier before, from time to time they do filter their threat advisories based on geographic area or indeed industry. The next question I have here is, can we provide advice on what threats to test first? So that's a great question, because it's kind of half and half. So one half of that of the answer is, we will cede to the opinion of better threat-based experts on what are the high priority threats to test in your specific organizational environment. We are simply the testing platform that allows you to do that testing. However, I would also say, in our defense, there are obviously some high priority threat scenarios that you might want to test anyway. And some of them appear more generic, but actually they're generic because they're really important. So things like the MITRE most exploited techniques would be an obvious one. So if they are the techniques that threat actors are using in most of the observed attacks in the last 12 months, it obviously makes a lot of sense to be able to test your defenses against those techniques. Our own research team have come up with the Validato top 25 techniques, because we believe those 25 are used in hundreds of different attacks and attack methods and chains. So again, hardening against both of those scenarios would be a very good idea. But the top ransomware techniques is also another very good one too. I hope that answered that question for you. So my next question is, how does informed threat defense mechanism help with regulatory and compliance concerns? Yeah, it's one of those habitual security versus compliance questions, right? So I think the best way to answer this is, I fully understand that lots of people in today's call are from organizations that are highly regulated. So it is really important to obviously comply against different framework requirements or different local industry regulation. But I would say Validato's primary focus here is ultimately to try and make a cyber resilient infrastructure and organization. And by doing so, you should be better able to comply with frameworks. The one thing I should say about our particular platform at Validato is that every threat scenario that we include and we test, we automatically map back to a number of globally adopted frameworks. So we map back to MITRE Defend, by the way. We map back to NIST Cybersecurity Framework, NIST 853, and ISO 27001. And from time to time, we can provide specific industry or geographic mapping. So we've recently, for instance, complete a mapping to the UK government's CAF framework, which is a cyber assessment framework, which is an NCSC specific cyber assessment framework for public sector organizations in the UK. So if there are other frameworks, then in short, to answer that question, you can run a threat scenario, map it to MITRE, look at the results in Validato, and see how you did against the control items in terms of protection and detection. Hope that answers that. Please do keep the questions coming, because they're very good questions. So I think maybe this question probably came in before we showed the on-screen demonstration, but can we test specific threats that target our business? And yes, I think as I showed you with the, I think it was the process injection custom scenario, you can create as many custom scenarios as you like with pretty much no coding in the Validato platform. So you can test anything you like. That's a good question. As new threats emerge, how is Validato updated? So the short answer is all the time. And in some cases within minutes of new threat advisories and information being published. So there are some obvious sources of information and threat-based data we get. So if it's a government advisory, for instance, we tend to update those on a very rapid basis, certainly within hours or a day or so of the threat being published. And it's much easier for Validato if the threat advisory or the threat intelligence information is able to be mapped back to the techniques that relate to MITRE attack. So again, if you have threat-based information and you haven't done that mapping, you can use tools like Decider to create that mapping for you, and you can create a custom scenario in Validato very quickly, within minutes, if we haven't already got it. So that's a pretty easy way to answer that, I think. So I think that's the end of the questions I have on the screen right now. If you are too polite to ask any questions, we are always happy to take your questions and comments privately. You can contact us through sales@validato.io. And otherwise, I'd just like to thank you for attending today's session on threat-informed defense. I hope we helped to answer what it is and in a practical way, how you might be able to implement threat-informed defense in your organization. Again, if you have any questions, please do message us through sales@Validato, and be very happy to answer your questions in your own time. So thank you very much, and goodbye.